A warm welcome to the program. I'm Felicity Ezewike. So it took us about a fortnight to finally get to this conversation, but I'm glad we're here. Thank you for your patience and understanding. I'm talking about the South Africa's G20 Presidency. Members of the G20, that's 19 countries, as well as the African Union and the European Union, represents 85% of global GDP, 75% of international trade, and 2/3 of the world's population. Because of its size and strategic importance, the G20 has a crucial role in setting the path for the future of global economic growth. During her presidency, South Africa will host a summit of heads of states and government. It will also be responsible for organizing and chairing about 200 meetings of ministers and officials. Thus, the presidency is set to represent an opportunity for South Africa to promote reforms in global economic governance. In the next half hour, we will explore not just the opportunities, but the constraints therein for South Africa. My guest is Felisa Nkomo, an economist, and she joins us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Felisa, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening. I must thank you for speaking with us. I know we had to reschedule again last week, so we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Let's begin. What does this presidency in 2025 mean for South Africa and the continent?
Well, the G20 president means a lot for South Africa. It means a lot for Africa for several reasons. I think the first issue is that it grants an opportunity for South Africa to start interrogating the whole global financial architecture in terms of the rules, the policies, and the practices, and whether it actually seeks to address the challenges of developing countries. So, and which amongst those would be around investment and trade as well. So I do that what South Africa needs to start doing as well is to really say, now that AU has a seat in the table within the G20, how do we make it sure that the economic challenges that are confronted by Africa broadly gets to be part of the center stage, so that South Africa really advances a very clear agenda for both South Africa and Africa. The first issue, for example, that South Africa needs to center, it's around the support for Africa Free Trade Agreement, which I think for me it's one of the critical, trade agreements that require support both from a financing perspective, but also the global international financial architecture must also support the implementation for a number of things. For instance, for Africa, in fact, to experience industrial development, it requires financing, right? So it means that amongst the key things that G20 could do and South Africa could actually push is that G20 countries could actually pledge some funding towards the free trade, supporting both the negotiation processes, but also fundamentally supporting industrialization of several countries within Africa who in fact are driving not only industrialization agenda, but also making sure that they create jobs at local level, they deal with issues of high unemployment, social inequality, food insecurity, and poverty.
Okay, you've raised two issues, particularly global finance infrastructure and pushing for more funding for free trade, Africa continental free trade area. But before we get to, because we know there was a meeting, let me see if I have that right now. There was a meeting that focused on, one second, let me see. There was a meeting recently of the financial institutions as part of this. South Africa is supposed to host over 200 meetings, and one of them was involving the World Bank and IMF. We'll come to that in a bit because I know that's very important to talk about. But there is something else before we get there, and that's the agenda that was inherited by South Africa from Brazil. that they are the current G20 chair. So how can they use the presidency to drive reforms in global economic governance that you mentioned if they're not setting the agenda? Because there seems to be an agenda already that they will have to work with come 2025.
Now, one of the most interesting things, by the way, is that Brazil is part of Global South. So inheriting an agenda that is coming from a Global South country is actually something that is quite welcomed. But obviously, what South Africa needs to do is to be able to infuse its own agenda within that. I can assure you, amongst the key things, for example, that Brazil in its own agenda would likely to have been pursuing is quite similar. It's around how to make sure that we transform the global financial architecture to make sure that it supports the developing countries. I mean, we know that one of the key things around the Global South, but as well as in Africa, is the issue of recurring financial crisis and debt crisis and all other social consequences associated with that, right? But also macroeconomic stagnation, for instance, challenges around economic growth, high interest rates, etc. So what then South Africa needs to do, even if it gets that type of an agenda from Brazil, it needs to say, what is it that the G20 presidency should mean for South Africa, and what should it mean for Africa? For instance, there are two things that I think for me South Africa would need to infuse. I mean, there are also a lot more. One of those, for example, is a resource mobilization to support industrialization. The other one is the need to really regulate the credit rating agencies. I don't know if you would recall that in 2009, South Africa was actually given a responsibility, early days of the formation of G20, is to make it sure that it looks at the regulation of credit ratings, particularly because I think one of the concerns for African countries and Global South broadly is that the credit rating agencies are not only applying conservative rules based on neoliberal policy regime when it comes to actually rating African countries, but also they classify them as risky country, meaning that they end up borrowing money at a high interest rate. So a simple example, South Africa, with all its challenges, but also with all its challenges and the fact that they've actually fought very hard to have what we call a very stable, macroeconomic environment. South Africa still borrows money at actually 9% in the global financial markets. And for me, that's problematic because comparatively speaking, most of the EU countries actually borrow their money at less than 4%. And that's the work of the credit ratings, right? And which I think actually is quite problematic. So in essence, that's one of the key things, because then linked to Africa's industrialization is Africa's ability to be able to mobilize resources in the financial market without being constrained by some of these credit ratings.
All right. The meeting I was referencing was the IMF World Bank spring meeting. It held in April in the U.S. And one of the key things there was suggestion of achievable objectives. And you've highlighted two of them, specifically the IMF reform. And the second concerns the relationship between international organization and member states. So I want you to expand our understanding of the issues at stake here. Why is there an urgent need for the reform of IMF and the global finance situation?
IMF reforms, but also even the multilateral institutions, has really been at the heart of the has always been a concern by particularly even from civil society organizations. It's always been a concern around how these multilateral financial institutions are actually structured. Because what they're doing is that they actually regulate financial systems, and their regulation outcomes are actually felt at a domestic level. For instance, you would recall that one of the first things they often do whenever countries are running into either debt crisis or macroeconomic instability, they often actually propose that countries should actually firstly introduce macroeconomic austerity measures, both from a macroeconomic perspective in a form of monetary policy and as well as fiscal policy. And one of the key things they actually miss that actually when countries are in a crisis, you still need to actually implement what we call counter-cyclical measures to make it sure that you stimulate both the supply side and the demand side of the economy. And that's why they need. So, I mean, there's even something else. For instance, you would know that amongst the key things as well, the IMF had actually recently, through Basel III, is the increase of the reserve requirements at bank level, but also is to increase, the risk assessment, profile of the risk assessment tools that get used within the banking system. The third one is around the classification of, good debt or new debt, etc. Now, when you think about collectively some of those interventions, they do constrain developing countries in Africa in particular, where there's a limited access to credit. So if, for instance, there's a push for higher reserve requirements, it means that the banks would have to do that, but also it also means that the banks will have to actually be more conservative in how it lends. And the risk about lack of access to credit, the consequences is that it actually stagnates the economy, because it means that entrepreneurs and businesses don't have access to credit. Something else, in fact, that in your earlier question that I actually omitted to mention, that one of the key things that South Africa needs to actually monitor needs to actually push for as part of its agenda within G20 is an establishment of a secretariat that will actually monitor these commitments. So the interesting point you made, you said South Africa would be taking over from a Brazil agenda. The key question, who gets to monitor that, right? So one of the key things that South Africa must push for is that there must be an established secretariat for G20 that monitors every commitments that gets made in every meeting. I mean, G20 has been around for more than a decade now. It meets on an annual basis. And amongst the key things, they make commitments around gender justice issues, access to education, access to water, macroeconomic stability, supporting countries with debt crises, industrialization, as well as sustainable development goals. And they make, if you read, for example, the commitments from India, so you can see that, there are a myriad of, commitments that have been made. But the biggest issue is that you have no one to follow through. So whenever South Africa is even going to be passed on the baton by Brazil, but it needs to be able to have a report, and the Secretariat must be able to say, we've actually tracked the commitments that were made in India. We've tracked the commitment that were made in Brazil.
No, Felicia, just to interject, please don't lose your train of thought, but I needed you to clarify here. When you talk about creating a secretariat to monitor these commitments, what has been the precedence over the years? You said that the G20 has been in existence and some commitments have been made over the years. What has been the process of monitoring these commitments, and how do you think that what gives you the mind to think that they might consider creating a secretariat primarily for this?
Actually, this is quite important. What G20 as a multilateral forum has been doing is that the host country establishes a secretariat system. It coordinates the pre-engagement meetings, which are led by Sherpas. Sherpas are normally the advisors to the president or to the ministers, and they have different streams, that actually meet and influence the final agenda of the 2 to 3 days. So once the country has hosted the G20 meeting, it passes it on. It announces there's a declaration unto which all governments sign up to, and the president will come through and they'll make speeches, around where do they think the world is and what are the things that needs to be committed to. And the criticism that has really been coming through from global civil society organizations in particular has been that you actually have no way, with no mechanism of tracking through the commitments that are that are made in every forum. In fact, the risk that you have is that after the announcements that have been made in declaration, is that countries could just easily revert back to some of the things that they were doing incorrectly, that they would have committed to within the G20. So the key issue is that then we need to be able to make it sure that we track that. I mean, one of the key things, for instance, if I make an example, we've seen both during the COVID and even during the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly in the EU, that countries were able to mobilize resources very fast to deal with COVID and address the humanitarian crisis. So one of the key things, again, that should be sitting in the reform agenda for South Africa is actually a fund that seeks to address, firstly, a just transition. The second one, specific intervention around climate change. Now, you and I are actually having this conversation today on the back of floods in one of the big cities in South Africa, Durban. It's on the East Coast, Eastern Cape, which is in the East Coast as well of South Africa. I mean, they've been experiencing rain, and it's quite rare that actually there's so much rain in winter in several parts of the country in South Africa. And normally, one area that normally have most of rains is the Western Cape. But now we have two provinces that are experiencing, a rain season. And it's not only just a normal rain, but it's actually floods. So it means that, and we know that Mozambique has been experiencing that recently. We know Tanzania have had similar experiences of floods.
So, Vila, I keep interjecting. Okay, just land. Let me see if you cover the question I wanted to ask. Hello? Melissa, can you hear me?
So that I'm saying, yes, I can hear you.
All right, go ahead.
The point I was making then is that, so what South Africa, as part of its reform agenda, is to request for G20 to set fund a climate crisis fund to support just transition, but also in the short to medium term to support the possibility of citizens having to move from different places due to climate change crisis.
Okay, so I want you to stay with the climate change conversation and talk to us about the economics of climate change at the G20. I'm not an economist. I don't even have a clear understanding of the financial conversations around these issues, but I know that it formed part of the discussions at the meeting, the IMF and World Bank spring meeting in April. So I want you to educate us a little on how this will play out, not only for South Africa, but for the continent.
I think the first issue is that, we've seen that there's been meetings around COP, I think now almost COP 26 or 27, where countries are expected to make commitments. And in fact, one of the assessments by several economists and even environmental activists is that the global north has not been forthcoming in actually making very strong commitments in ensuring that we deal with climate crisis. Now, that's the first thing. I think the second issue is that the contribution of developing countries in terms of the climate change, because we're not very much industrialized countries, is actually of emissions is actually less comparing to global south, global north, because global north is highly industrialized, so their emissions are much more higher. But the effects of those emissions are actually felt within the global south. So one of the demands that have been put on the table in the last 15 years is that there needs to be development finance mechanisms that are put in place to support a just transition. But of course, just transition has to be cognizant of what we call the development paradigm or the state of each country before we can push for just transition. So let me make an example. South Africa's energy, or electricity, is currently coal dependent. We've over the years started introducing renewables, but there's a clear consensus that you can't build a resilient economy on the back of renewables because most of them rely on weather conditions, wind, sun. So it means that part of that just transition, if South Africa decides to move from coal into renewable energy, it's going to require support. And the reason why South Africa is going to require support is because South Africa is the lowest contributor in emissions, but also even though we contribute less than 2% through our power energy. But for us to actually move into just a transition, we actually need support. But we've also recognized that that support cannot happen overnight because we need to link it. What is our industrial development strategy that is linked to coal, but also that is linked as well to just transition? So if we are then decarbonizing the economies, there needs to be a fund. So the countries that have the highest contribution in terms of emissions must take responsibility by actually making sure that they contribute in the fund a lot more. And almost 80 to 90% of the G20 countries actually contributes to the emissions more comparing to global South and South. Hence, the demand for development finance mechanisms to support decarbonization. And we must accept that it will take a while because at the heart of it is technology. It's also skills which is technical capacity, but also at the same time, it also means that there will then be new ways into which we need to drive our own industrial agenda as developing countries and as well as the global South.
Okay, there's really so much to unpack, a lot for South Africa to accomplish with this presidency. A lot is riding on it. Then again, I think it's fair to ask. I know when South Africa is working, it's not just, she won't be working only for South Africa, it will be for the continent. But how can South Africa balance its own national interest with the need for these global cooperation and collective action that we talk about, particularly like you talked about climate change and economic inequality?
Well, I think the balance is actually quite clear. In fact, South Africa is approaching the G20 presidency with this climate change crisis. So in essence, what it needs to do is to be able to allow other African countries and global South to really leverage on the back of that. So meaning that South Africa needs to push for the setting up of the global climate change fund. So that's the first issue. And in the second issue, I think what South Africa needs to also push for is a bit of a commitment on sustainable development goals, setting up a fund to address several issues. We know the crisis of gender-based violence, in Africa. South Africa has really developed a very good national strategic plan, which in fact it could really galvanize G20 countries to set up, to actually provide similar support and support African women. So can you see the balancing act? Is that already, there's a climate change, there's a call for climate change fund. South Africa is going to benefit, and that will also benefit Africa. The second one is around establishment of gender-based violence fund, but also the other one, it's around industrialization agenda, right? How do we support African countries how do we support African countries in their journey of structural reforms? African countries cannot only be locked into exporting primary goods. So they need to start actually building beneficiation centers. And we can do this, by the way, on the back of free trade agreement. Okay. So in essence, Now that South Africa has the reserve of lithium, Zimbabwe has a reserve of yttrium, DRC has a reserve of several, primary goods that are used both in automotive sector and as well as in the mobile phones. So different countries have different things. So in essence, part of what that call for industrialization program will benefit South Africa, but also it will benefit as well the African continent. In fact, South Africa does not have a luxury of time to actually focus on national interest for a number of reasons. South Africa is one of the strongest countries industrially in the continent, so it needs to be able to use its presidency for the benefit of the continent.
Great.
Secondly, it's a migrant recipient country, and in essence, and part of the reason why it's receiving so many migrants is because people are moving out of their countries seeking better opportunities for in South Africa. So it's actually better if South Africa is actually galvanizing resources for industrial investment in other countries to limit the current pressure that is actually experiencing.
We have less than 2 minutes to wrap up, so I'll ask that in 40 seconds, if you can, talk to us about the key message you wish to send out for world leaders and global citizens regarding the presidency and its potential impact on global economy.
The recurring financial and debt crisis that African countries are experiencing have not been adequately addressed by multilateral financial architecture. So therefore, the G20 presidency that will be led by South Africa for another 12 months must be a catalytic change and lead to fundamental reforms of the G20. 3 things it must do. It must set up the climate change crisis fund. The second one must be an industrialization fund to support just transition and decarbonization. The third one, it must be the establishment of the G20 Secretariat to track the commitments and support Africa's agenda.
I might not know a lot, but I do agree completely with you on the need for a secretariat, because if we don't track these commitments, what really are we doing? It's just talking at the end of the day. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
While this G20 presidency is viewed as a complex challenge with both significant opportunities and daunting constraints, the suggestion is that if South Africa focuses on the right strategies, it definitely can leverage the platform to make an important impact both for herself and the African continent. Now, after the break, we will be looking at African Summit, this time hosted by South Korea. What is in it for Africa, and what really is the point? There's been some hesitation among African leaders about what some have described as the summoning periodically of leaders to other parts of the world to talk about how they can be partners with us. Interesting conversation ahead. Stay with us.